Hello, and welcome to Season 5 of Lightwork Presents Everything is Connected. I'm your host, Folasade Ologundudu, and on the show, I'll share the interesting and inspiring stories of artists, critical thinkers, thought leaders, and art professionals on a wide range of topics about life, work, society, success and failure, and the ways in which we navigate life. We talk about our inspirations, concerns, and the ideas that motivate and propel us to create. Much of the show centers on visual arts and its pervasiveness in our society, how culture shapes our lives, and the responsibility of artists and curators not only to be truth tellers, but to advocate for and care for the massive impact that culture plays in our lives, from the things we believe in to the ways in which we understand ourselves. As I travel to art fairs, gallery openings, and events within the creative industries both in the U.S. and abroad, join me in discovering and learning about some of today's most interesting and dynamic artists and creative professionals. If you're new to the show, I'm glad to have you here. If you've been on this journey with me for a while, welcome back. Let's get it. On this episode, I'm joined by Ekow Eshun. Ekow Eshun is a writer, editor, and curator known for his work in arts, culture, and identity. In this episode, we discussed his latest exhibition, The Time Is Always Now, Artists Reframe the Black Figure, on view now through February 9th at the Philadelphia Museum of Art. So if you're in Philly or close by, make sure you check it out before it closes. The show brings together over 60 contemporary works that unfold around three core themes: double consciousness, past and presence, and our aliveness. As the former director of the ICA London, Eshun played a significant role in shaping the institution's programming. He is the author of several books, including Black Gold of the Sun, Searching for Home in England and Africa, a memoir exploring his personal identity and heritage, Africa, State of Mind, Contemporary Photography Reimagines a Continent, published in 2020, a visual and conceptual exploration of African photography, and In the Black Fantastic, published in 2022. It's an acclaimed exhibition that Ekow presented at the Hayward Gallery in London, showcasing Black artists who use fantasy and mythology to explore race and identity. Whether through the arts, through literature, or through media, Ekow continuously challenges and reframes narratives around Black identity. Let's dive into my next episode with Ekow Eshun. Thank you so much for joining me on an episode of Everything is Connected. I'm really looking forward to speaking with you today.
Thank you.
Let's jump right in. So it's top of the year 2025, and we met late last year at the opening of your exhibition that's still on view now and closes on February 9th. The Time Is Always Now.
Yeah, thank you. And again, thank you very much for inviting me on your show. The time is always now actually comes from a Baldwin quote. It comes from a James Baldwin quote where James Baldwin is talking about the urgency of civil rights action in the 1960s. It became the title of this exhibition that's currently on show at the Philadelphia Museum of Art and is moving, in fact, after Philly to North Carolina, opens in North Carolina in March. An exhibition originated in 2024 at the National Portrait Gallery in London. The Time Is Always Now is a large group show that brings together Black artists that are engaging with figuration, with whose work depict the Black body, and are using that as a way to reflect on Black being, Black present, Black interiority, the richness and complexity of Black life. When Baldwin talked about the time is always now, he was talking at a time of crisis and urgency. In terms of adopting that title, it's less about how the work of Black artists is often as if it exists in a kind of moment without history, as if it exists as a kind of fad or a novelty. This is certainly the case often with trends in Black music, hip hop, or any other trends, or any other movements. When they come out, they're described as flash in the pan, a fad, a trend, something that will come and go, something that's not real or authentic or grounded in history. So with The Time Is Always Now as a title, I wanted to think about how, in this case, visual artists have been thinking about and speaking about and articulating, yes, in this particular moment, because I would say in the last 10 years or so, we've been through a particular flourishing when it comes to the work of Black figurative artists, Kerry James Marshall, Amy Sherald, Henry Taylor, Toyin Oji-Odutola, lots and lots of different artists who were in the show. But I really wanted to emphasize the always aspect of this, which is that one of the things that we, as Black people, have always done is to explore and interrogate and articulate the nature of our being, of Blackness, the fraughtness and fragility and tension and hostility that comes from living as a Black person in a world that is sometimes hostile to our presence, but then the poetry that can follow from harnessing both a history of sorrow and marginalization, but a history also of solidarity. This is just some of the things I wanted to capture in the show, because these are some of the things that I saw in the work of the artists who were within the exhibition.
And as we talk a little bit more about the show and the artists in the exhibition, there are some incredible works that have been included in the show. You mentioned artists like Kerry James Marshall and Henry Taylor. Are there any pieces that particularly stand out to you or for you that are very indicative of, maybe more than others, or just in general, artworks that are very indicative of the ideas that you are investigating in the show?
I was privileged and pleased to be able to include the work of Noah Davis in the show. Noah Davis is an extraordinary artist who died young, about a decade ago. Really, I'm not even going to say at the height of his powers, because clearly he had so much more to give. He's a painter who painted both with delicacy about Black experience, but also with an ability to think in slightly dreamlike and hallucinatory terms. There are two works that we have in the show. Only one of them, in fact, is in Philly, but which is a work called Black Wall Street, where Noah Davis reimagines the Tulsa Race Massacre of 1923 and conjures this not as a kind of realist, but as a work that takes real events and stretches them into the nightmarish and hallucinatory in ways that are compelling and mesmerizing and strange. There's another work that we included in the show when it was in London, the National Portrait Gallery, which is a work by Noah Davis called 1975, which is a work where he takes a photograph that his mother took in 1975 of an open-air swimming pool, full of Black people in a pool. There's a figure that's diving across the kind of center of the painting. We only see that figure legs and heels because they're already halfway into the water. The water is a brilliant blue. There are figures having fun in the water and in the edges of the water. The sun is alive in the sky. The water is blue. But we think also of the long history of the ways that sites of leisure in America, like swimming pools and beaches and schools, even in other circumstances, were sites of segregation. So that the swimming pool is not a neutral territory. It's a territory that's been racialized. It's a territory that historically has been a site of all forms of tension. So Noah Davis's invocation of the swimming pool as a site of pleasure is a site of liberation. It makes the ordinary joy and pleasure of that scene all the more pointed. It becomes both political and poetic as a painting, as an invocation of history, as an invocation of being and persistent solidarity and kinship. So I find his work enormously moving.
Yes, I love that you expanded on that. I'd like to take a moment and go back to something you said earlier in your first response. You spoke about the idea of Black artistic expression being a trend and being talked about and written about in that way, a flash in the pan, something that happens only for a moment and isn't steeped in a long-standing history of having been here creating. And I thought about the ideas of the trends in Black music, which you mentioned, and hip-hop having been one of the most prolific musical forms that we've seen in modern history. And now we see the shift with Afro beats. And so we're still very dominant in terms of popular music. And I think there's this clear understanding that many of us have of how powerful music is and how spiritual it is, and its ability to really impress our minds and have deep psychological impacts. And I wanted to talk a little bit about the idea of us as a people of across the diaspora having been here, and the idea that the things that we do are not trends and not flashes in the pan, but that there is a sense in some way, because of the way the West has been organized, that Black artists and Black creatives are tasked with legitimizing themselves in the eyes of those who hold power. Do you subscribe to that way of thinking? Do you feel that we are challenged to legitimize ourselves? Or alternatively, do we not have to take up that work, but we simply have to take up space?
Oh, that's such a great question. Thank you. That's such a great question, and so richly phrased. Because both of those options that you lay out at the end there, in fact, are both accurate. I would say, yes, we have to defend the legacies that we inherit and interpret in the moment. And then at the same time, sometimes we want just to be. So, in a way, this is really the creative tension that each of us as Black people, certainly Black creative people, or Black people in general, we carry within us. Every one of us as an individual carries within it. Every one of us as an individual who lives in the West, we carry within us 400 years of history, 400 years that begins with forced transportation, part of our cultural heritage. This is what we inherit. That comes with sometimes with a heaviness, it comes with a weight, it comes with a burden, but it also comes with, I think, the opportunity to say, if this is our heritage, then how do we interpret that? If this is our heritage, how do we speak of that? And how do we make of that something that is relevant and resonant for us today? How do we draw on that to assert our aliveness and our presence in the world as it stands right now, flawed and fragile as that past is? How do we make ourselves people who can walk in the light, who can move forward irrespective of the tensions and constant attempt to hold us back, to marginalize us, to silence us, all of these things? So the art and the culture, the making, becomes part of that task and that challenge to insist upon being seen. This is all within the work. And then at the same time, again, as you just really super eloquently pointed out, there is another way of thinking about this, which is to say, actually, look, let's imagine ourselves whole. Let's conjure ourselves in the moment. Let's work with the spontaneity, the improvisation that comes from saying, actually, we insist upon our freedom to imagine, to invent, to create anew. I think both things are happening at the same time when we hear something extraordinary, something new in the form of a music form, or in fact, in the form of art or cinema. These things have to come from a place of optimism, which says, I will make anew, I will create anew. But the cultural, the historical context for them is still this larger story of who collectively we are.
Beautiful. So wonderfully and richly said. Thank you for that. I'm wondering if we can go a little bit further back into your story and how you arrived here, and pull up on the fact that I believe it's in, correct me if I'm wrong, but in 2005, you published Black Gold of the Sun, Searching for Home in England and Africa. How is it that you arrived at the place where you are currently investigating these ideas, thinking about the world from the perspective that you do, and then wanting to ask questions and possibly provide answers to those questions through art, through exhibitions, through writing, through curating? Let's talk a little bit about some of those origins.
20 years ago, I wrote my first book, Black Gold of the Sun, which is a memoir, which was really, in a way, it was one of the start points of me trying to figure out this story, really, of who I am in the context of these larger currents and forces. Black Gold of the Sun was a memoir that really told my personal story as well as some other people's stories, and was really tracking my own path. So I was born in Britain. I lived for a couple of years as a small child in Ghana, West Africa, where my family comes from. And in the book, I go back as an adult to really for the first time since childhood. In the 60s, Ghana was an interesting place for a variety of figures to go to. Maya Angelou was there, Malcolm X visited there, Muhammad Ali visited there, W.E.B. Du Bois moved there, settled there, died there. So I was interested in what figures who, like myself, who've lived outside Africa might find in exploring Africa, and whether that might take us closer to ourselves or take us somewhere else. So that book it was an exploration for me of where I might fit or how I might try to understand my place in the world. If you live diasporically, which is to say, if your origins are from one place and you live in another place, you've a question constantly about where you're from, where you belong. I was wrestling with and continue to wrestle with. These are some of the things I wanted to think about, precisely because when I was a child growing up in Britain, I remember vividly being born in Britain, going to Ghana, and coming back to Britain when I was maybe 5 or so, and being struck by the peculiarity, the strangeness of British culture and its ability to conjure race and conjure ideas of us and racial superiority and inferiority. Race was the unspoken conversation of the culture. There was always this implicit thing which said that people weren't really part of whatever it meant to be British. And that idea haunted me from childhood. And it's been something that I've tried to explore with Black Gold of the Sun and with other work that I've done. And I suppose the revelation that came to me at some point in childhood and adulthood and set me off on this course was the idea that actually these questions that I was asking from quite early on, at some point I realized that I wasn't alone. When you discover James Baldwin for the first time, it's revelatory. When I discovered scholars and theorists like Stuart Hall or Paul Gilroy or Bell Hooks for the first time, it was revelatory because I realized there'd been a conversation taking place for generations before me. Some of these questions, how it feels to live and move through the world as a Black person, to move through a world that is not necessarily open to you, but also then what it means to live with a consciousness that the idea of race is a social construction, is something that is created in the 19th century without scientific fact, but it is still a lived reality of our shared existence. So how does it feel to live within a fiction? How does it feel to live within a myth? How does it feel to know that the construction that is put upon you is fixed and yet real, is fixed and yet flawed? It seems to be permeable and yet is fluid. All of these things I've been fascinated by my whole life because some of those questions have been visited upon me from a very early age. And simply as a way to figure out how I can live without being overburdened these questions and by the articulations that are put upon them by others, I've had to try and figure out some of this territory for myself.
Yes. As you described the ideas that you've been investigating for much of your career and things that you were thinking about early on that led you to this work, I'm curious about another show that you produced very recently, In the Black Fantastic, which investigates Afrofuturism and ideas of an alternative way of seeing, being, and existing, and a radical sort of new perceptions that Black artists are creating for themselves, and ideas of an always evolving artistic lineage. Can you speak briefly about that exhibition, In the Black Fantastic?
Sure. In the Black Fantastic, this is a show that I did at the Hayward Gallery in London. It's a show that brought together a range of different artists: Nick Cave, Wangechi Mutu, Chris Cara Walker, Ellen Gallagher, range of artists who, it seemed to me, were doing something similar, which was, as Black artists, drawing on myth and fable as a way to grapple with the apparent fixities of the idea of race, as a way to look beyond the binaries imposed on Black people binaries of black and white, superior, inferior, civilized, uncivilized, to think beyond some of the othering that black people are subjected to, and to reach into imagined territories, historic realms, to draw from history and fable and myth and the future simultaneously, and in that process to create and conjure these extraordinary artworks that take us into other worlds, other ways of seeing, other propositions for being. One of the things that excited me about thinking about the work of these different artists is that the way they as readily reach back into the past, as readily into myth, into fable, into other forms of belief systems or knowledge systems. It's really about how these artists are tapping into and drawing from and speaking back to these cultures of different African countries, the cultures of diasporic communities, the Western world, all of these different ways of seeing that already exist, and that as artists, they're interested in drawing from, speaking back to, interpreting, reimagining. So the show and the book that came with it, it was like walking into and exploring the worlds and individual cosmoses of different cultures that they had seen and accessed and gave license to. Just to say that, yeah, in the Black Fantastic, really way of thinking about how some of these things, fantasy, superstition, these things that are supposed to be somehow illegitimate, not serious, not rational.
Yes, that brings me back a little bit to the show that's currently on view, The Time Is Now, Artists Reframe the Black Figure, and in thinking about the three core themes that the exhibition unfolds around, and thinking about the notion of past and presence. Not just thinking about artists who are looking to the future, as you described, and that the show was not just about an Afrofuturistic theme, but being able to look back and draw on that well of knowledge and bring that to the fore and bring that to the contemporary moment.
Look, this is the thing, and you'll know this as well. You've talked to a bunch of artists, pretty smart, interested, and imaginative people, and they don't tend to work in linear ways when it comes to thinking about how they make their work. So one of the things I've always been interested in is if you follow the gaze of an artist, it can take you to interesting places. It can take you back into the past as much as into the present or the future. And often when work is imagined to simply be, I don't know, about one thing, but when you talk to an artist, actually they have something very different in mind. They have a whole language with which they're trying to explore things inside their heads and inside their bodies. And often the goal of an exhibition or a curator is to try and find a way to establish the terms under which their work can be seen, hopefully more clearly and within a richer context.
Absolutely. This was such a lovely episode, Ekow. Thank you for your time. I was at Nick Cave's opening here in New York City, and at the opening I bumped into the chief curator of photography and film at the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History, LaCharles Ward. And he said to me, we were talking about your show, and he said to me, I think it's the best show not only in the country right now, but one of the best shows I've seen in years. The installation of the works, the showcasing, and the breadth and scale were all deeply impactful for me. And I thought that really resonated with me as well, because in experiencing and walking through the exhibition at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, I was really astounded by how you utilized that space, especially with the work of Thomas Price, and breaking up that exhibition space with that work where you could see both rooms.
I really appreciate that feedback. When you create an exhibition like this, the goal for me is to think both about the artworks individually and about the flow of the artworks through the space, but also about the space itself and what it is we're trying to create with that space overall. And I suppose the goal for me is to say, let's have a proposition for Black aliveness. As soon as you step over the threshold into the space, how do we articulate
the texture, the richness, the complexity and possibility of Black life. We see that in the artworks, but the space itself has to be sympathetic to that experience, so that we have not just an individual experience in terms of looking at one artwork or another, but a social experience, a whole larger feeling of being, which comes from how we organize the space, the color of the walls, wall texts in themselves. Let's not think about the space as some sort of neutral space. Let's think about this as an active space, that speaks of Black being. That's the challenge. Can you do anything that does justice to the work? That's what I set myself as a curator in these circumstances to do, to say, can we create something that has the poetry and lyricism of each individual work? Now you're in conversation with this history of 400 years of displacement, of searching towards being, of reaching towards kinship, of sharing, of thought, of beauty, delicacy, and solidarity. All of this is in the room, whether it's on the walls or just within the texture of the space. And I guess that's what I was trying to summon, at least some of that, because it seems to me these are the salient issues when we're dealing with an exploration of Black being, Black body, a Black figure, Black being within space.
You've certainly rose to the challenge of producing an incredible show. Ekow Eshun, this has been such a wonderful episode. I encourage all of my listeners, go and visit the show. The time is now. Artists Reframe the Black Figure, on view now through February 9th at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, showcasing more than 60 contemporary works of art. And it will be moving to the North Carolina Museum of Art in early March, and you'll have an opportunity to see it there. So thank you again, Ekow, for such a wonderful episode.
Thank you for having me on the show. It's been great talking to you.
That was my episode with Ekow Eshun. I want to give a big thank you to Ekow for joining me on the show. And it's a wrap, folks. That was our episode of Lightwork Presents Everything is Connected. Conversations on culture and current events with some of today's hottest creative contemporaries. These episodes are recorded remotely and on location wherever in the world that I find myself, whether that be Africa, the US, Europe, the Middle East, or the Caribbean. Depending on where I am at the time of these recordings, you will hear the sights and the sounds of my local environment. I look forward to continuing these wonderful conversations with you, with artists and creative professionals across a variety of industries. I'm your host, Folasade Ologundudu, and we'll see you next time. As always, stay motivated, stay inspired, and stay up. Peace and love, y'all. We out.